Mate, it is episode 6 of the Property Strategy
Already?
Podcast. I know.
We're
pumping through these things. I like it.
Yes.
And today is probably one of my favorite topics. It's all about the different stages of building out a property portfolio. So, we've been talking pretty heavily so far around buying property, setting up the portfolio, setting your goals, understanding really why you want to build out a portfolio, financing, different types of structuring. Like, we've covered a lot of ground, but that's kind of getting everything set up. That's kind of getting you set up for your portfolio. But when you build out a portfolio, we're generally talking about like a 15 to kind of 30-year plan, depending on what you want and what your exit strategy is going to look like. But there's essentially 4 key stages that you go through when you're doing when you're doing a whole portfolio from start to finish. It starts with acquisition. This is kind of what we've been talking about, purchasing, buying thing, and kind of within acquisition, there's kind of like, depending on what you want to buy, and we've talked about the different strategies and everything else like that, but generally we see those different types of assets being purchased, where it's either growth focused, momentum, which is a combination of growth and cash flow, and then the cash flow property itself. And so that acquisition phase is probably anywhere between 5 to maybe 10 years.
Obviously, depending on how much of a deposit you've got, how well the properties have performed, how many assets you need in the portfolio. But yeah, typically somewhere between 5 and maybe even 15 as the outer limit.
Yeah. And as we've talked about a number of times, like, your strategy can change over time as well. So you might get through that 5 to 10 year window. You've done your acquisitions, maybe you're capped on your borrowing capacity. And now you're kind of like, well, what I want is a little bit different. Like, the portfolio's done its time. We've seen some good growth. Maybe some of the properties have doubled in value, but now we really just want some cash flow. And so this is kind of when we move into the secondary stage of building our portfolio. And this is what we like to call consolidation. Do you want to walk us through what's involved when consolidating the portfolio?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it probably starts at like a really good holistic review as to what's happening. How are the properties performing? I mean, we should be doing this more regularly than most people probably would be. But yeah, just sitting down and assessing each of the properties in the portfolio. Like, I bought you with the intent of X. Have you delivered on that? Yes, no. Is there a fabulous amount of growth and maybe that particular market and you don't see much, well, you potentially see some better opportunities elsewhere? Or is it probably underperformed? Because often we like to kind of not feel as though our purchases haven't been as poor as maybe they have been, and really staring down and looking at these things. And maybe you've got multiple properties and you can potentially compare these assets against each other and go, okay, well, yeah, I bought you with the intent of whatever it may have been, cash flow or growth. And if the property's done none, well, what are you doing in my portfolio? So again, just really delving into an overall review of each of the assets. And for myself personally, it was at that kind of review phase where I did have a number of properties there, and I was looking at them going, well, you aren't doing anything. So from a growth perspective, it kind of started okay and then just sat stagnant. And it wasn't like I bought it and then 4 months later I was like, why isn't this thing growing? It was probably like a 6 or 7 year period. Cash flow was terrible, always terrible, and the growth wasn't there either. So for me, it was an opportunity cost. And we kind of said property, high entry and exit, but also at the same time, opportunity cost could be even greater, particularly if you've got hundreds of thousands of dollars tied up in that asset and it's not doing anything from a growth perspective or a cash flow perspective. So for me, the opportunity cost was far too great that I actually decided to sell that property to then reinvest into something else.
So everything that we've talked up to date is really trying to get you to the position where you come to this consolidation phase and you don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
You've bought the right assets, you've bought them in the right order, they're all serving a purpose within your portfolio. And if you do make a mistake, I don't want you to wait until you get to 10 to 15 years to go, all right, now I've got to do something about it. If we're buying a dud asset that hasn't performed, or maybe it's in a market that we haven't performed, or maybe we've bought, an apartment that hasn't done anything for 10 years or previously, and, now we've gotten educated and realized, well, maybe that asset isn't probably the best asset. We want you to be able to, unfortunately, cop the transaction costs, but, not have that as an opportunity cost within your portfolio, because the funds that you've allocated towards that could be in a much better investment. So try and, go through those phases as early as you possibly can. But if you do, in Joey's circumstance, get 5, 8, 10 years in and then go, okay, portfolio is built. I'm happy with everything kind of sits. There's one asset in here that really isn't serving a purpose. Let's now move forward and exchange. Out of curiosity, did you buy anything to replace that particular asset?
I did,
Okay.
yeah.
Cool.
And it has performed much better from a growth perspective.
Cool.
So the opportunity cost was far too great. And then so far it's worked out that transition of funds into a different asset has performed.
Yeah. And so, I mean, if you're in this phase now and you feel like, oh, I wish I didn't make that mistake, like, it's okay. Everyone makes mistakes.
We just don't like to admit them sometimes.
Correct.
And it actually took me probably too many years, maybe even more than that. I always kind of had this feeling. I was like, well, maybe it'll turn. I was like, you know what? No.
Yeah, so there's a concept called sunk cost bias, essentially, when you've put cash into the deal and you've got it done, you're like proud of it yourself, but then you realize, oh, it's not that great. You're like, no, it'll work out. But it sometimes it just doesn't. And the earlier you make a decision on those calls, the better off it's going to be for you financially. So consolidation can be a combination of just understanding, well, is every property in the portfolio actually serving my purpose? Or it could be, all right, the first start of the portfolio has done really well. It's gotten the growth out. We now are moving to the high yield, high income type scenario. Let's take the profits on what we've purchased at the start, move more into the high cash flow type scenario, and then move into that potential, retirement, high income type of phase.
And that's probably more what we'd like rather than to necessarily identify a lemon. We hope that doesn't happen within your portfolio. But yeah, more commonly we'd see maybe like some really good capital appreciation in an asset, and maybe it's a point where our incomes have increased and we can potentially extract some equity out of the portfolio to help fund maybe a higher cash flow play as we transition into retirement, or some of the other strategies that we've spoken about earlier, in that plenty of capital appreciation. Maybe we liquidate an asset within the portfolio and that helps us put down a nice big deposit on a higher cash flowing asset as we're kind of transitioning closer to retirement, when we tend to need those dollars and we need the cash flow a little bit more than we maybe necessarily needed as we started out the portfolio.
Yeah, that's phase number 1 is acquisition. Phase number 2 is consolidation. Hopefully after consolidation, we're really happy with the portfolio. We've set it up, it's doing its thing, it's ticking away, and we just really need time to do its thing now. So the third phase that we go into is all about debt stabilisation. And most of the time, you really don't have to do too much within this phase. It's just time ticking away. But there's a couple of little things as we go through, the last sort of 5, 10, 15 years of the portfolio that we just need to keep on top of and monitor.
And maybe they're happening a little bit earlier in the portfolio as well. It's like the debt stabilisation might actually happen partway through your acquisition phase, or maybe partway through your consolidation phase, or it doesn't necessarily have to be towards the back end of the portfolio. But we obviously want to start to plan things a little bit more in terms of, okay, what are we actually doing from a finance perspective as we're transitioning into retirement, particularly if, for example, we're carrying a whole bunch of IO debt, 5-year term after 5-year term after 5-year term. What are we going to start to do with that? And we'll kind of chat to exit strategies next moving forward. But Jordan, if you kind of delve into a little bit more around this kind of debt stabilisation piece.
Yeah, so last episode we talked a lot about principal and interest only, and why I personally would always go interest only. The downside of interest only is it's usually a 5-year term where you can only pay interest only, and then it does flip over to the P&I term, right? And so you've only really got 5 years at that lower repayment before you're forced to make a principal repayment. And when it flips over, guess what? You've got to make up for the 5 years where you're only paying interest only. So you have to pay more principal in order to do so. And so as a very minimum, you probably want every 5 years to refinance back to an interest only loan. Again, you're taking that loan term out to 30 years, which feels counterintuitive because you're never paying down your debt. But if you're using the strategies like the offset account that we were mentioning beforehand and paying down offset rather than actual debt, it's the same thing essentially, but we're just locking in that additional 5 years worth of interest only repayments and getting a little bit more flexibility around why to do that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be every 5 years on the dot. What we're really looking for here is potentially times in the economy where rates are really low. And if we're really happy with where the rates are currently, we can lock in that lower rate for another 5 years or whatever it might be. So it's not like it's 5 years, 5 years, 5 years. It might be 2 years, then 3 years, then full 5 years, then back to another 2 years. It's just really assessing, number one, what are the loan products that are available at the moment, at what particular rates, and can we lock it in and be happy with the refinancing thing. On top of that, there's a concept called recasting debt, which is Joey's favorite term.
I love it, yeah.
And the whole concept behind recasting debt is when we sign a 30-year mortgage, we're essentially signing it at that point in time. So let's say we have done a principal and interest repayment, and let's say that it is 10 grand a month. Now, when you sign a P&I loan, you have to make the 10 grand repayment. Doesn't matter how much is in your offset account. Doesn't matter about the rate. If rates move up and down. No, it doesn't matter about rates up and down. You have to pay the 10 grand, right? And so what happens, depending on what the rate is in the back end, if it's variable, or how much you have in your offset account, determines how much of that goes towards interest repayment and how much of it goes towards principal repayments. So let's say it's been a nice 15 years. You've paid half your mortgage off. Let's just say for argument's sake, let's say you had $1 million to begin with. You're stuck on these P&I repayments. You've paid half of it off down to $500,000, and we're now 15 years down the track. at 15 years, you still have to make the $10,000 repayment. But there's this concept called recasting debt where we essentially go, okay, well, with the 500K loan that we've got now, if we recast that, meaning we're going to take it back to another 30-year loan, we're no longer being assessed on the $1 million and have to make the 10K repayments. We're actually being reassessed on the 500,000 that we've got left on this debt. Yes, it's going to be another 30 years, but our repayments, instead of being 10 grand, are going to be 5 grand. So it's the same amount of debt. You are going to be paying a lot more interest on this because you're recasting it out to 30 grand, but it's a way more manageable from a cash flow perspective. And if you're using your offset account again, you can reduce that payments required anyway. So essentially, all we're doing is managing our cash flows by doing so. You could be fully offset in this, so it doesn't really matter what the interest repayments are going to be either way if you're fully offset, but it just doesn't require you to pay as much every month towards that loan, and you're reducing your cash flow. So if you are maybe going through a season where you might be slowing down with your income and maybe taking a day or two off of work, or maybe you've got grandkids coming along and you want to spend a bit more time with them, or whatever it might be, instead of being forced to pay the 10 grand and being have to pay it off in another 15 years, you can pull that down. Yes, you're going to pay more interest. Yes, it's going to be another 30 years, but you're not forced to make that extra repayment.
Yeah, absolutely. And just kind of while we're that it might not necessarily be for everyone. So it's going to dictate where at the point in life in which you are. Like, for example, if you were 75, I dare say you're probably not going to be able to recast that for another 30 years. So there's obviously plenty of variables, but kind of on the whole there, a really kind of common thing that we and generally see people do, just obviously help with a little bit of cash flow management as you're starting to particularly ease into retirement, which is probably a pretty good segue into some of the kind of exit strategies. And I know kind of the term, they might not even actually, like in my opinion, I don't actually think it's spoken about often enough. We always talk about buy. But then what do we do with this level of debt that we've got? Like, what are some of the ways in which we can help to retire out the debt? Because it's always this world of acquire, and don't worry about the debt.
Yeah, exactly. And it's this is what we're talking about with keeping the end in mind. So you should probably really think about your exit strategy before you start to build out the portfolio so you can work your way back. But obviously the most common one, and we just talked a lot about it, is just the 30-year P&I repayment. So
of which we actually are starting to see a couple of lenders coming out now with a 40-year loan term.
Yeah, that's crazy. You told me about that.
Pretty incredible.
It's common over in the US, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or a little bit more common.
In some other markets, yeah. But if a 40-year loan term, and if only it takes a couple of kind of pioneers for that to potentially become the norm.
Yeah, it could definitely become the norm.
But yes, definitely.
What would be the benefit of a 40-year loan over a 30-year loan?
Yeah, really see a cash flow. Yes, you're going to be paying higher interest, right? So, for example, if your total interest payable was $600,000, so your debt was $600 and you end up paying 1.2, over a 40-year loan term, you might pay 1.4. Obviously, don't quote me on the number. So, higher interest that you're going to be paying, but much more manageable from a cash flow perspective. Again, coming back to what I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, probably not going to be for every investor, and you probably you might not be able to get that loan term depending on your age and kind of where you are in your working career. But for the younger people coming through and buying homes and investment properties, it could be a really kind of favorable loan product for them.
Number 2 of exit strategy is something called just selling off the assets. Now, this used to be a lot more sort of marketed, and well, it probably is still marketed, but the whole concept of you buy 10 properties to begin with, you wait 15 years, then you sell 5 of them, and you take the profits from the 5 to pay the debt off of the other 5, and then you're left with 5 beautiful, nice, clean, debt-free assets, right? That was the whole concept. But as we've said, this whole way along, you're capped at your borrowing capacity limit. And so it's very hard in today's environment to go out and buy 10 assets essentially. So it's less like, buy 10, sell 5, but it might be buy that one really strong growth asset, hold it for 15 years, buy these other really nice, like strong cash flowing assets that, maintain and build the portfolio. And then you get to a point where the growth focused asset has done its due, it's done its time, it's doubled or maybe even tripled in value. And by selling that asset, you can completely eliminate the rest of the debt on the portfolio. Yep. And then you're debt free. You probably got some cash left over as well. And you've got the cash flow coming in from the rest of the portfolio.
Yeah, a nice, really, really common one. The other thing that we're kind of seeing here, and this might be kind of playing into part of the reason why we are really big advocates of kind of going that interest only route, because you kind of go interest only and you keep going interest only. Like what ends up happening to that debt, and potentially over a period, if we're kind of maximizing the use of that offset account, we hopefully would like to see a point in which we might be able to start making some bulk kind of pay downs of that loan, or potentially even get to a point where our money sitting in offset, our savings actually matches or outstrips the amount of debt that we have in the portfolio. So effectively we are debt free at that point, because we could retire out our debt because we have more money in savings than we do in debt. And as we were accumulating that level of savings in the offset account, we were paying less interest throughout. So really, really common. If we kind of touch on that a little bit as well, and I know I heard you say this a couple of years ago, and it kind of really, really resonated with me. And I kind of put it in even from like my own perspective. Like if you look back and go, oh, let's say, for example, if my parents, for argument's sake, they bought a house in Sydney for, well, I don't know what it was, $80,000 in the 80s. If they took out, let's call it 100 grand. If they took out an 80% loan, interest only, then $80,000 and remained interest only until this day, the property probably worth $3.5 million. It's kind of drop in the ocean, isn't it? With respect, if that $80,000 stayed interest only until now, what's that as an LVR position? I'm not even going to try and do the math, but
exactly.
pretty low.
Yeah, so the whole concept is, again, if you bought $1 million property today, the debt was $800,000. You were on interest only the whole time over 30 years, but that $1 million property went to $6 million, for example. Now you're comparing an $800,000 loan to a $6 million property, drop in the ocean. So you're just watching that debt slowly come down. And it ties really nicely into the next strategy that we go through. So depending on how detailed you want to go into the monetary system and the economy, and I'd highly recommending like diving deep into it. It's 1,000 episodes in its own right, so we're not going to get into it. But there's a book called The Debt Millionaire. I can't remember the author's name, but go check that out if you really want to delve into it. It's probably one of my favorite books. There's a concept in the economy called inflation. And so what inflation means is the value of money deflates over time. So it's not necessarily always that $1 million property is going to $6 million because it's increasing in value. There's also the effect of inflation coming into the effect of that. And a good context is like, let's say a basket of goods today costs you $100. In the same 30-year time period, the same basket of goods might cost you $600. Now that's kind of like uncomprehendable to think like, oh, I'm going to pay $600 for a couple of eggs and some bread and some milk, and that's going to cost me a fortune. But that's inflation coming down over time. And so when we talk about another exit strategy, which is what we were just talking about before with recasting debt, some people are so comfortable with debt that even when they move into that retirement phase of life, they're actually more comfortable having debt due to inflation.
Yep. Because
when you have debt, it's someone else's money that's paying for the inflation. They make their money by you paying the interest rate. But if it's a large debt amount, they're happy for you. They're happy to pay for the inflation because you're paying the interest rate. It might be, a 1% spread or whatever it might be. But many people are really comfortable with having debt. And so even if they move into that older retirement age, 60 plus. And as Joey mentioned, like there's going to come a point in time where you can't recast or you can't refinance. But as an exit strategy, they might go, okay, I'm 55. I'm going to retire in 5 years time. Let's try and refinance now on that P&I loan, 30-year P&I loan, whatever it might be, recast, pull those interest repayments all the way down. But I'm happy to just have the debt. And even if I die and the debt's not paid off, I really would prefer to have the debt because inflation is going to take away it slowly, and it's going to be a generational wealth play, and I can pass this over to the next generation or whatever it might be. So a lot of simple exit strategies have just been like, let's just maintain the debt that's left on it
debt,
and just let it time do its thing.
And we've heard the words come out of people's mouth saying like, I want to carry debt into retirement, which again sounds so counterintuitive, but it's that thought of obviously inflation eroding the purchasing power into the future. So you actually want to carry that debt into retirement there. You mentioned the word, a bit morbid, you mentioned the word death, but another kind of really, we don't think about it, but it's actually going to happen for most, is that kind of inheritance. And we're kind of seeing that intergenerational monetary switch happen at the moment now, where kind of these boomers are potentially kind of getting towards that kind of phase of life. And we are starting to see a little bit of a transition of wealth as kind of the people who have been living in these big blocks of land in like a 6-bedroom house and only occupying 1 bedroom as they're passing. And then they've got whatever it might be, 2 or 3 kids. The properties are then being sold, and then like the money is shifting from generation to generation. So people don't factor this in, and we very, very, very rarely see it. One, because, well, probably most commonly because people don't want to think about it.
Yeah,
they don't want to think about it. But the harsh reality is, at some point, you are probably going to inherit a large sum of money. Obviously, depending on family relationships and whatnot, that could be used to put a sledgehammer through your debt.
100%. And even if you don't feel like your parents are wealthy or they're going to be able to pass things over, like say they, same situation, bought a family home for $80,000 30 years ago. Now all of a sudden that house is worth $2, $3, $4 million. Well, guess what? At some point in time, they may pass away and they might hand that over to you. And so, even if there's a number of kids within the asset pool, hopefully it's split up nice and evenly so everyone gets a fair go. But that is definitely something to factor in terms of the portfolio, especially if you're a bit squeamish about, going into that kind of retirement phase phase with
Carrying
debt. Yeah.
Obviously, you can't put a year on it, right? And you don't want to think about it. But at some point, you would think during your retirement, you probably will get a chunk of inheritance that could be used to retire your debt. Really, really hard to plan for, obviously. And
What about this really, really cool thing that the government forced us to do to put super away every single year? Do you reckon we can use some of that?
There you go. Exactly right. So at some point, we should, hopefully, depending on what legislation looks like. At the moment, it's quite advantageous to put lots of your surplus dollars in super. But that also could be another thing. As we start to kind of approach that pension phase, we should get access to, hopefully, we would like to think a large sum of money. That one could be used to help offset some debt, could be used to pay out some debt, could be helped to use part of your retirement as well. But one that, again, maybe it's starting to pick up a little bit, but people generally go, oh, take me out of my house in a box. But people are starting to think about it a little bit more. It's that kind of downsizing approach there. We're going, well, we raise the whatever it is, 2.5 kids, whatever it is, that household average there. And we no longer need this double-story house on a 600 square meter block with a backyard that's too big to manage anymore. What about if we sold that down and then we bought something right-sized for us? Maybe it was a nice apartment just across the road over there. We sold the house across here for whatever it is, 3.5 mil, and then we went and spent $1 million over here, and we've got $2.5 million gain, capital gain tax-free, potentially, because it was our principal place of residence, and our debt level is whatever it is. Well, there's a really nice big chunk of money to potentially retire out some debt.
Yeah, 100%. So same scenario. If you are the one who's got kids and you're the one with the $4, $5, $6 million family home, you might go, you know what? Stuff the kids. It's time to enjoy. So you could look to downsize. Sell that off at $6 million. Maybe you buy something that's nice and livable, a little bit smaller, a little bit manageable at $1.5, $2 million or something like that, and then use the rest of the funds to potentially buy $4 million commercial property on a 6% yield, and you've got some good cash coming in. And so even if you have just bought the family home and you've been paying that down for the last 15 years or whatever it might be, the best thing is you got your foot into the ladder, you got some funds into a house, and you can let time do its thing. As long as you bought that asset correctly and a good quality asset, it's still going to work in your favor, and there's still lots of ways that you can look to exit out of that portfolio by doing so.
So we've covered a whole heap there. I think we covered off like maybe 6 or 7 different kinds of exit strategies, and you might kind of go into them with one. Maybe you're kind of going in with a P&I mindset, and then you might kind of go through a period there of IO, and you might kind of throw in a recast of debt, and then all of a sudden you get a bit of inheritance, and then you do the downsize. So you might kind of enter into your retirement phase kind of almost employing each and every one of these different strategies that we've discussed here.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can definitely do a combination. You could sell one asset, then you could use your super, then you've got some inheritance, and all of a sudden
roll over to P&I.
You're debt free.
Yeah, exactly.
Good to go. So in a summary, just to recap, different phases of a portfolio. You have your acquisition phase where you're doing heavy purchases, consolidation, just making sure that every property in the portfolio is performing well and doing what you need it to do. Debt stabilisation, making sure our finances are sorted every single year, making sure we're refinancing in good economies, making sure that we're never rolling over to P&I and getting stung pretty hard with a change in fees. And then exit strategy. How do we get out of this thing? What does it look like for debt retirement? What do we actually like? Do we want to carry debt into retirement? Do we not? So they're generally the 4 different stages that we see in building out a portfolio. So that's episode 6 wrapped up.
Good fun.
Pumping through these things. Next episode is all going to be about money management. So keen to see you on that one.
See you guys.